So now we continue with the main line, one of the main lines in Jaenisch Gambit. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, f5, knight c3, f takes e4, knight takes e4. We have seen this position in the last section already, so d5. And now the main move for white is to take on e5. Obviously, black has to take on e4. And now white takes the knight c6. So black has three moves. He can play queen d5, he can take on c6, and he can play queen g5. Surprisingly, the last move, queen g5, is the strongest one, but I want to show you briefly what happens if we play, for example, queen d5. White has c4, queen goes to d6. Now, for example, queen g5 is bad because of d4, queen takes g2 and queen h5. After g6, queen e5, black is lost. So here the point is that in this position the bishop b5 does not hang anymore. So if black plays queen g5 immediately, then the bishop hangs. So c4, queen d6, knight takes a7, and bishop d7. After c6, knight takes c8, rook takes c8, bishop a4. Obviously, black doesn't have enough. White simply can castle in the next move and then play d4, give 1 pawn back, but he will still keep an extra pawn. So bishop d7 is practically forced. Bishop takes d7, queen takes d7. And now the most unpleasant line for black is queen h5, g6, queen e5, king f7, knight b5, c6, and queen d4. And I think here black does not have enough compensation. He is not even close to it actually. After queen takes h8, knight f6, here this position is very specific, and here in fact black might have good compensation, but after queen d4 he doesn't. So this is why queen d5 is not so good. Let me show you why taking on c6 immediately is not good too. Bishop takes c6, bishop d7, queen h5 first. Of course, after bishop takes a8, queen takes a8, in this situation the position of black is very good. I think he has good chances. But white has strong queen h5. Now after g6, queen e5, here of course black cannot play king f7 because of bishop d5. And after knight e7 or bishop e7, white will take first on a8, then on h8, and this is another situation. So here white has two rooks. This is not so good. So after queen h5, black is forced to play king e7, queen e5 check. Black has to play bishop e6 because after king f7, bishop d5 follows. So bishop e6. Now it's time to take on a8. Queen takes a8. Queen takes c7. King f6. Short castle. King g6, d3. And well, it's obvious. First of all, white has, like 3 pawns, and 3 pawns and rook so he has material advantage, and in addition the king is on g6. Black has no chance here. So this shows why taking on c6 is not good. So we are left with only possibility, namely the move queen g5. So this is a double attack. Pawn g2 hangs, bishop b5 hangs. White usually protects the bishop by playing queen e2. So taking on g2 doesn't bring much now because I think taking on g2 is not good because of queen h5. After g6 again queen e5 and the white is going to win. So to make the idea queen takes g2 serious, black has first to play knight f6. This move is obvious. First of all, the knight protects the pawn e4. Secondly, it takes under control the square h5. And finally, this is simply a development move. So now, the main move for white in this position is f4. A very interesting question is why does knight a7 not work well? And the problem here is that black has a very simple move. Bishop takes d7. Bishop takes d7. Knight takes d7. Queen takes e4. Pawn g2 hangs otherwise. Bishop e7. Now the knight from a7 cannot go anywhere, so white is forced to take on b7. Black castles short. White has to castle 2. It's important to see that d4 does not work because of queen a5 and then rook takes a7. So short castle, bishop d6, and I think here black has excellent compensation. He has many ideas. He can try to play rook fb8 if he wants to. He can play knight f6, knight e5 with ideas like knight f3 or knight f6 with idea bishop takes h2. And white is undeveloped, so I think the compensation is very good. Also, in addition to this variation, I think that it is possible to take on d7 with a king. White gives check on b5. Queen takes b5, knight takes b5, and black can play bishop c5. Despite the fact that white has 2 extra pawns, black is better developed, and the problem is of white is the bishop on c1. And the most important is that black wants to play rook f8 and knight g4, and pawn f2 will become weak. So in this position, the development of black plays important role, and I think that he might have compensation too. However, if you decide to play this endgame, I suggest you to look at it with computer in more details, because the computer will show you pretty quickly whether black has enough compensation or not. Another line, by the way, it also makes sense to look with computer to see how black gets a dangerous attack of the king. So this is taking on a7. It is to say that after knight e5, c6, the best move for white is f4, and we will transfer to the main line. So let's see what happens after f4 immediately. Queen takes f4. It's not good to play queen h4, g3, queen h3. It looks like black might get some counterplay because of bishop g4 idea, and because the white squares are weak in the position of white. But let's see, knight e5 check, c6, and bishop c4. Now, after bishop c5, white simply plays d3, and well, I think that this position is much better because black cannot castle too quickly, and the idea of white is simply to play bishop d2 or bishop e3 and castle long, and his position is fine. So queen takes f4, and here we have an important position. White has an option. He can play knight e5 immediately, or he can play d4. The two moves differ in the following way. After d4, black can go with his queen to d6, and this we will analyze in the next section. And after knight e5, black is forced to play c6, and then white can play d4 in the next move, forcing the queen to go to h4. So, 10th move, knight e5, c6, and d4. I think that knight takes c6 doesn't work because of a6. This is good enough. Bishop a4, bishop d7. So this is actually why the whole variation, the Jaenisch Gambit, holds, because after knight e5, always black plays c6, and white cannot take on c6 second time. So c6, d4, of course. Now it takes d3 is not good for several reasons. I think the easiest here is to take on d3 with the bishop. Now the queen hangs on f4, and wherever the queen goes, for example h4, then g3, and then the next move the knight goes from e5 and kills black. So don't take on d3, give check instead. White has the only move g3, and black goes to h3. So now the bishop hangs, and again knight takes, c6 doesn't work because of a6, bishop a4, bishop d7. That's again the most important idea in Jaenisch, because the variation is really forced, and if white could simply take on c6, then I guess black would be simply lost. So bishop c4. Now it's unpleasant that white can give check on f7 or play knight f7 at some point. Black doesn't want to lose the right to castle, so he plays bishop e6. White has three possible moves. One of them is queen f1. This is the easiest. You can simply take on f1. Rook takes f1, and now black has two possibilities. He can play knight d5, which is nice because white cannot attack the pawn e4, and after bishop d2, black has e3. Strong idea. What is also possible is you can take on c4, knight takes c4 and play h6. Long castle is also possible now after c3, now h6. The idea is to prevent white from playing bishop g5. In general, in this situation, you should try to keep your knight, because if you stay with the bishop against the white knight, then the pawn e4 will be very weak. But in general, why I wouldn't like to play this position is because white king is very close to the pawn e4, and the pawn e4 may become really weak, and I don't see any counterplay for black. That's why I would prefer to play knight d5 after a rook takes f1. So this is queen f1. Next move is bishop f4, but this is by far not as dangerous as the main line that we will look shortly, that starts with bishop g5. Here black simply castles long castle, bishop d6, king b1, rook h e8, hf1, king b8, prophylactical moves, nothing hangs. If white takes on e6, black takes back with the rook. Queen on h3 stays good because it attacks pawn h2, and I don't see any serious troubles here. for black. And I think this position has been played extensively, and there are a lot of games, and there is no game where white could prove a real opening advantage. So finally, main position is after bishop g5. Black has to castle long. If instead he plays bishop d6 and tries to play with a short castle, which also makes sense because now his other rook goes to e8 and the f file plays also a role, but there is an unpleasant trick here. White can play knight g4, and this really hurts. Instead of this, if white would take on f6, then black has no problems after g takes f6, knight g4, bishop takes c4, queen takes c4, and king h8. Now there is no way white can prevent black from playing f5. For example, after queen e6, in this situation black has a strong move rook e8, and then the pawn e starts going. What is also possible here is to play f5. After queen takes d6, queen takes g4, position is about equality. But knight g4 is a move that makes problems for black. So knight g4, bishop takes c4, queen takes g4 is not good because of queen takes g4, the bishop cannot take, and after knight takes g4, bishop takes e6, black loses the knight on g4. So knight g4, bishop takes c4, this is a must, and now knight takes f6, rook takes f6, after g takes f6, queen takes c4, king goes to h8, bishop e3, here the position of black is not so good, of course. Rook takes f6, queen takes c4, king goes to e6. After queen takes e6, rook takes e6, I would say that the position is equal, but the problem is that white doesn't exchange the queens. Instead, he has a very strong move d5. C takes d5, queen takes d5. Queen takes d5, rook takes d5, rook e6, rook h d1, bishop f8, and bishop e3. So the pawn e4 is blocked. White has the control over the d file. Rook d7 is an interesting idea. Rook d8 is possible. And the king from c1 can later at some point go to d2, then maybe to e3. The pawn e4 is weak in this situation, and black has absolutely no counterplay. This is what matters the most. There is no way he can play actively in this situation. And for this reason, I think that white has he has a big advantage here. So 14th bishop d6 is not good. You have to play with long castle again, also here. After bishop g5, you make the long castle. Long castle. Instead of long castle taking on f6, doesn't bring much again, g takes f6. Now, of course, knight g4 doesn't work because of bishop takes g4. So, white has to take on e6, queen takes e6, knight g4, and rook takes d4, and black is simply better. So, after a long castle, pawn d4 hangs, so white has to castle long too, bishop d6. The bishop, in this position, the bishop should always go to d6. This is the best place for him. So black tries to play as active as possible. Bishop d6. Rook h f1. The alternatives instead are, for example, well, yeah, bishop takes e6, but then queen takes e6, queen c4, and rook h e8. And the position of knight e5 is not as stable as white wish it to be. Another possible move is knight f7. Bishop takes f7, bishop takes f7, rook h f8. So black has to play dynamically here. Bishop c4, rook d e8. And here, because the knight from e5 has gone, the pawn e4 becomes pretty dangerous. Rook h goes to f1. d5 doesn't work because of knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, c takes d5, rook takes d5, and bishop takes g3. Very simple. There is no checkmate because king can simply go to b8, and the king is not weak at all. So instead of d5, rook h f1 seems reasonable, but then black can simply go with the king. There is no threat. White doesn't want to play anything. So king b8, king b1. If black wants, he can even play h6, forcing white to take on f6. Because if the bishop goes back, then, well, no problem for black. Bishop takes f6, g takes f6 with the idea f5, f4. And after all, or h5, h4. And after all, because of different colored bishops, I think this is absolutely equal position. So the last thing to show here is 16th rook h f1 immediately instead of knight f7. Black plays rook h e8. Bishop takes f6, g takes f6. Rook takes f6. Bishop takes e5. Now, if white takes on e5, then black can take on d1. White is forced to take with the king. Bishop takes c4, queen takes c4, and now black can choose. He can play queen h2 or queen h5 and queen takes e5. In both cases, his position is very good. So after bishop takes e5, white should take on e6. Rook takes e6. Bishop takes e6. Bishop takes e6. D takes e5. And the simplest way to play now is to take on d1. King takes d1. Queen takes e5, and this position should be draw. This endgame is, of course, there's no chance for white to win. So this goes pretty long, but the last moves are not so important. These are just easy moves to find. What you need to know is how to play at the very beginning after knight takes e5, knight takes c6. So the important move is queen g5, knight f6, and then you need to know the idea that first of all that white cannot take on c6. So you can play c6, don't make any other crazy move. And secondly, you put your queen on h3 and play this position with long castle. This is all you need to know about this variation. And in the next section, I'll show you what happens if instead of knight e5, in move number 10, if instead of knight e5, white plays d4 immediately. You will see there is an important difference between these lines. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next section.